The voicemail arrived at 2:14 a.m., recorded in a voice that sounded steady only because it was trying not to break. There was no background noise, no traffic, no television hum, just breathing, controlled, deliberate, like someone standing very still in the dark. When she spoke, she didn't say her name. She didn't need to. "I did what I had to do," the woman said. "I need you to understand that." She paused, as if listening for footsteps that never came. "I couldn't stay silent anymore." 17 seconds. That was all. No goodbye, no explanation, just a quiet certainty, followed by a soft click as the recording ended. By morning, she was gone. Her house sat exactly as it had the night before. The front door locked, the windows shut, her handbag still hanging by the entryway, keys inside. There were no signs of panic, no overturned furniture, no hurried packing. The bed was neatly made, the way she always left it. Even the kitchen light, habitually turned off, was dark. Only her phone was missing. At first, people assumed a misunderstanding, a sudden trip, a cooling-off period after an argument. She was known for her discipline, her routines, her predictability. She did not disappear without reason. She did not abandon responsibilities. And she certainly did not leave messages like that. But as hours turned into a day and then two, the voicemail began to feel heavier, less like a statement, more like confession. Those who listened to it noticed the careful phrasing. Not "I told the truth," but "I did what I had to do." Not "I exposed them," but "I couldn't stay silent." The words suggested consequence, awareness, fear that arrived only after a line had been crossed. Investigators would later describe the message as emotionally contained, a phrase that barely captured its restraint. This was not panic. This was resolve under pressure, the sound of someone who had already accepted what might follow. And what followed was nothing. No credit card use, no digital trace, no witnesses who could say they saw her leave. The world did not watch her vanish. It simply noticed she was no longer there. The voicemail became the center of everything, the last confirmed moment of her existence. A message that was never meant to be found so easily, or perhaps one that was meant to be found by exactly the wrong people. Because whoever she was speaking to already knew the truth, and whoever else heard it would soon begin asking the question that still lingers unanswered. What did she expose that made disappearing seem inevitable? The voicemail didn't match the woman people thought they knew. Those who had spent years around her described someone precise to the point of rigidity. She believed in schedules, in rules that left little room for interpretation, in the quiet comfort of things being where they were supposed to be. Disorder unsettled her. Silence, when chosen, felt safer than chaos. She had built her life that way, carefully, deliberately, after a childhood shaped by instability she rarely spoke about. Order was not a preference. It was protection, and motherhood, for her, became an extension of that belief. Raising her daughter had never been about warmth or indulgence. It was about guidance, structure, teaching her how to survive a world that, in the mother's view, punished carelessness without mercy. She monitored homework, friendships, curfews, not because she didn't trust her child, but because she didn't trust what influence could do when left unchecked. As the years passed, that vigilance hardened into distance. The daughter grew quieter, more private. Her laughter dimmed, replaced by a watchfulness that mirrored her mother's own. There were late nights at school, sudden changes in routine, explanations that arrived just believable enough to avoid further questioning. The mother noticed everything. She always had. What changed was her certainty. Something was wrong. Not dangerous, not yet, but misaligned, like a door that no longer closed properly. At first, she told herself it was adolescence, then stress, then secrecy. She gave her daughter space, believing restraint was a form of trust. But restraint, she would later realize, can also be avoidance. The realization didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments. A message seen too quickly, a name mentioned too often, a tension that entered the room before her daughter did. Each detail felt small on its own. Together, they formed a pattern she didn't want to see. When she finally allowed herself to name it, The thought felt intrusive, almost cruel. She dismissed it, reframed it, corrected herself. But the mind doesn't forget what the instincts recognize. The mother didn't confront anyone immediately. Instead, she watched, listened, counted the days between changes in behavior. The discipline that once brought her peace now fueled her anxiety. Order could no longer explain what was happening inside her own home. And in the quiet hours, when routine offered no comfort, she began to understand the truth she would eventually face. This was not about control. This was about responsibility. By the time she accepted that something had crossed a line, the cost of ignoring it felt greater than the cost of acting. And for a woman who had built her life on consequences, that calculation mattered. She did not yet know who else was involved, but she knew one thing with devastating clarity. Whatever this secret was, it did not belong to a child alone. And the moment she understood that, her world began to tilt toward a name she had trusted without question. The name surfaced quietly, the way dangerous things often do. At first, it appeared in passing, spoken with familiarity, never explanation. Her daughter mentioned him the way students mention weather or deadlines, as if his presence required no context. He said this. He thinks that. He understands. Each reference carried an ease that unsettled the mother, not because it was inappropriate on its face, but because it was intimate in tone. She told herself not to overreact. Teachers mattered. Mentors shaped futures. Trust was the foundation of every school, every system meant to protect children from harm. And this particular teacher had earned that trust many times over. He was known as patient, thoughtful, the kind of educator parents admired and administrators defended. Students described him as someone who listened when others dismissed them, someone who stayed late, offered guidance, remembered details that made young people feel seen. In a world where attention was scarce, his felt generous, too generous. The mother noticed how her daughter's posture changed when his name was spoken. Shoulders tightening, eyes flicking away, the faintest hesitation before continuing. These were not signs of fear. They were signs of attachment. And attachment, when paired with authority, carried a weight the mother understood instinctively. She began paying closer attention to patterns, extra study sessions, messages justified as academic support, conversations that stretched beyond the classroom, beyond school hours. Each explanation stood on its own, reasonable and carefully framed. Together, they formed a structure that looked disturbingly like dependence. Still, there was no proof, only discomfort, only a growing sense that something was unfolding under the protection of respectability. The mother wrestled with the thought longer than she would later admit. Accusations could destroy lives. Misinterpretations could fracture families. And yet, ignoring warning signs felt like betrayal, not of the system, but of her child. What unsettled her most was not the teacher's access, but his composure. When she finally saw him in person, during a routine school event, he greeted her with practiced warmth. Polite, confident, his eyes lingered a second too long, as if measuring her awareness. Nothing in his demeanor suggested guilt. If anything, it suggested control. That night, the mother replayed the encounter again and again. The calmness, the lack of defensiveness, the ease with which he occupied his role. It struck her then that trust, once earned, often becomes invisibility. Predators, she knew, did not always look like threats. Sometimes they looked like solutions. She did not sleep. By morning, the question had sharpened into something unbearable. If this relationship was truly innocent, why did it feel so carefully hidden? She was no longer observing out of caution. She was observing out of necessity. And somewhere between suspicion and certainty, she realized the most dangerous part of the situation was not what she suspected, but how prepared he seemed to be if she ever spoke it aloud. The next step would not be silent. It would be confrontational. And it would happen where secrets could no longer pretend to be misunderstandings. The mother waited until the house was quiet. Dinner had passed with forced normalcy. Plates cleared, polite questions asked and answered, nothing that hinted at the storm gathering beneath the surface. Her daughter moved through the evening with a practiced calm, the kind that comes from knowing when not to ask questions, When the bedroom door finally closed and footsteps retreated down the hallway, the mother stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum, steady and indifferent. She chose her moment carefully. "Sit down," she said when her daughter returned, voice even, controlled. Not angry, not pleading. The way a person speaks when they are no longer seeking permission. Her daughter hesitated, just for a second. Then she sat. The mother did not accuse. She asked questions shaped like concern, like curiosity, like trust. "How often do you stay after class? Why does he text you so late? When did this start?" Each one landed softly, deliberately, and with each answer, the distance between them grew. At first, the daughter denied nothing. She reframed. She spoke of guidance, of understanding, of being seen in ways she never had before. She spoke of feeling special, mature, chosen, words that revealed more than she realized. The mother listened without interruption, though her chest tightened with every sentence. "This isn't what you think," the daughter finally said, voice sharpening. "You're making it something ugly." The mother met her eyes. "I'm naming what you won't." Silence filled the room. Not the awkward kind, the dangerous kind. When the truth finally surfaced, it did not arrive as a confession, but as a defense. The daughter insisted she was in control, that no one had forced her, that she loved him. The word love hung in the air, fragile and misplaced. The mother felt something fracture inside her, not rage, not fear, but grief. The realization that her child could not see the imbalance, the manipulation dressed as affection. "This isn't love," she said quietly. "It's influence." Her daughter stood abruptly. "You don't understand him. You don't understand me." The accusation cut deeper than denial ever could. The mother wanted to shout, to shake her, to force clarity through volume. Instead, she did what she had always done. She stayed controlled. She explained power dynamics. She explained responsibility. She explained why adults are obligated to draw lines, not blur them. Her daughter heard none of it. What the mother saw then was not rebellion, but loyalty, misplaced, unwavering, a loyalty that no longer belonged to her. "You'll ruin everything," the daughter whispered. Not a warning, a plea. In that moment, the mother understood the cost of silence. If she did nothing, she would be complicit. If she acted, she would become the villain in her daughter's story. There was no choice that ended without loss. The conversation ended without resolution. No slammed doors, no tears, just a mutual recognition that something irreversible had been said. That night, the mother sat alone in the dark, replaying every word. The daughter did not come to her room, did not say good night. And as the house settled into uneasy stillness, one truth rose above all others. This was no longer a family matter. By morning, the mother would step beyond the walls of her home, and the consequences of that decision would reach further than either of them could imagine. By sunrise, the mother had made her decision. The confrontation from the night before replayed in her mind like a film. She could not pause. She remembered the defiance in her daughter's eyes, the calm control in her voice, the quiet way she had justified what no one should justify. The mother had spent the night turning every possible course over in her mind, weighing silence against action. She had built a life on consequences, on moral responsibility. And in that careful calculus, one truth had become painfully clear. Inaction was no longer an option. She knew what she had to do. The school office smelled of coffee and photocopier paper when she arrived. The receptionist greeted her with a polite nod. Nobody could have guessed the weight she carried inside her coat pocket, in her clenched hands, in the careful steps that brought her to this place. She had rehearsed this moment for hours, imagining every possible reaction, every word she might use. And still, when the secretary's eyes met hers, a tremor ran through her chest. Her first words were quiet, almost casual, but there was an edge, a firmness that could not be ignored. "I need to speak to the principal," she said. "It's urgent." What followed was a controlled unraveling. She spoke of late-night messages, of unsupervised encounters, of trust being exploited. She spoke not as an angry parent, but as someone who had been forced to witness manipulation firsthand. Every word was deliberate, every pause measured. She did not speak of shame or revenge. She spoke of responsibility, protection, boundaries violated. The principal listened carefully. Nods were slow, notes were taken, and outside the closed office door, the world continued unaware of the revelation unfolding within. When the mother finished, she did not feel relief. She felt exposure, vulnerability, a quiet sense that she had crossed a line she could not uncross. There was no triumph here, no sense of justice served, just a cold understanding that truth, once spoken, has a way of changing everything, even for the one who delivers it. Back at home, she tried to reach her daughter, tried to explain, tried to anticipate the reaction. The phone rang unanswered. Messages went unread. And when the daughter finally did speak, it was not to plead or cry. It was to accuse. "You betrayed me," her daughter said, voice low and unwavering. "You don't understand what this means. You've made a mistake." The word struck the mother harder than any denial could have. She realized painfully that exposing the truth did not guarantee clarity, acceptance, or gratitude. It guaranteed conflict, distance, and isolation. She had warned herself of this, rehearsed it in every form possible. Yet the reality was sharper than any rehearsal. And then came the moments that truly frightened her. The calculated calm of the teacher, the sudden whispers among parents, the invisible ripple of awareness that traveled faster than words. It was one thing to confront a secret alone, in private. It was another to throw it into the light, where consequences unfolded unpredictably and relentlessly. Sitting alone that night, the mother realized the weight of her own decision. She had acted out of responsibility, out of a desire to protect. But protection had a cost that she now understood might be hers alone to bear. The house felt smaller. The walls seemed to watch. The quiet creaks of the floorboards were louder than ever. She understood, as she never had before, that morality was not always rewarded. Sometimes it was punished. Sometimes it was ignored. And sometimes it demanded courage she was unsure she possessed. Yet she also understood the necessity. Secrets thrive in shadows. Lies multiply without witnesses. Truth, no matter how inconvenient or painful, is a weapon and a shield. She did not yet know how far the consequences would reach. She did not yet know how irreversible this act would become. But she understood one thing with absolute clarity. By exposing the truth, she had stepped beyond the safety of observation and into a world where every action mattered, where every silence could no longer protect her. And as night deepened, she felt the first flicker of fear that would not leave her, the knowledge that when shadows stretch, even the one who illuminates them is not always safe. The next morning, she would face the world differently, and in doing so, she would set in motion a chain of events that would change everyone involved forever. The morning after the mother exposed the truth, the house was heavier than it had ever been. The sunlight filtered into the blinds, falling across the kitchen table, but it felt wrong, too bright, too revealing. Every object seemed to hold judgment. The coffee mug still half full, the placemats aligned perfectly, the clock ticking too loud. Nothing had moved, yet the space felt transformed, haunted by unspoken words. Her daughter sat across from her, shoulders tense, fingers drumming lightly on the table. Her eyes avoided the mother's, darting toward the window, the fridge, anything but the person who had shattered her carefully constructed world. Silence stretched between them, dense and suffocating. The daughter had not cried, not yelled, not begged. She had chosen something far more powerful. Refusal. Refusal to explain. Refusal to justify. Refusal to engage. For the mother, it was unbearable. Every attempt at conversation was met with flat, clipped answers or polite nods that conveyed nothing. She tried reason, appeal, even gentle reminders of boundaries. Each effort failed. The daughter had retreated inward, into a shell of quiet defiance, where loyalty had shifted from her mother to someone else entirely. That loyalty was invisible, but tangible in the careful way she avoided any acknowledgement of wrongdoing. In those quiet moments, the mother watched her child and understood a terrifying truth. The affair created a new hierarchy, one she was no longer part of. The teacher, calm, measured, unshakable, had become the axis around which her daughter's world now revolved. Emotional allegiance had been redirected, leaving the mother outside the orbit of influence, powerless to reclaim it. The daughter's silence was not empty. It was loaded. Every unspoken word carried accusation. Every glance held judgment. And every refusal to speak was a barrier, a wall erected so precisely that it seemed impenetrable. She was not simply hiding the truth. She was protecting it, preserving it, owning it. The mother realized that the exposure had done something she had not anticipated. It had not liberated her daughter. It had not drawn her closer. It had forced a choice upon her, a choice the daughter had made decisively. And in making that choice, the daughter had rejected the mother's perspective entirely. Late in the day, the mother attempted to bridge the gap again. She suggested counseling, a mediated conversation, a chance to understand the repercussions. Her daughter's eyes met hers briefly, a spark of something fierce, and then were gone. "I don't need anyone to explain anything to me," her daughter said softly. "I know what's right for me. I know what I feel. You can't change that." There it was. Not defiance, not anger, not even rebellion. A cold, absolute certainty that neither reasoning nor truth could penetrate. The mother leaned back, heart heavy, mind racing. She had acted to prevent harm, to assert boundaries. And yet, in the silence of the daughter, she realized protection had its limits. Morality could not always bend will. Authority could not always command allegiance. Love could not always prevent distance. That night, the mother sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen. The house had grown quieter, shadows pooling in corners that had always seemed familiar. She understood then that exposing the truth was only the beginning. The consequences, unseen, unpredictable, would ripple outward in ways she could not yet measure. And somewhere in the invisible space between them, the teacher's presence loomed larger than ever, shaping her daughter's choices with quiet, insidious influence. The mother's next steps would not be easy. She would need to confront not only the reality of the affair, but the power it held over her daughter and over herself. Because silence, she realized, could be just as dangerous as lies. And in the darkness, she knew the confrontation she had delayed with the world beyond the home was fast approaching. The next chapter would demand action, not observation. The stakes would no longer be private. The night had arrived quietly, almost innocuously, the kind of evening that would make a disappearance unnoticed until morning. The sky was clear, the streetlights flickering softly in the distance, casting long shadows across the mother's neatly trimmed yard. Inside, the house hummed with its usual domestic cadence. The refrigerator murmured, the HVAC pulsed, and the faint ticking of a clock marked the passage of time. Nothing seemed amiss. Yet for the mother, every sound was magnified. Every shadow seemed alive. Every creak of the floorboards reminded her that the decision she had made, exposing her daughter's secret, confronting the school, had set a chain in motion she could not control. She moved through the house with deliberate care, checking locks, securing windows, and arranging her belongings in a way that suggested routine. But this was no routine. This was preparation. She did not know who might be watching. She did not know what consequences had already begun to take root. All she knew was that she had acted with intention, and intention, she realized, could attract attention that was invisible until arrived. Her daughter had gone to her room early, avoiding any confrontation. She had chosen silence, and in doing so had allowed the household to become a tension-filled arena. The mother respected that choice, even if it pained her. She understood now that her daughter's loyalty had shifted, and the one she had trusted could no longer serve as a shield. As night deepened, the mother packed a small bag, not for travel, not for escape in the ordinary sense, for protection, for readiness, for possibility that the act of speaking the truth might demand immediate movement. She did not plan to run. She planned to disappear, if that became necessary. Her movements were methodical, almost ritualistic. She arranged her papers, secured her devices, and wrote a brief note, not accusatory, not explanatory, but simple and factual. It was meant to be found, yet not immediately, and only by the person she trusted most outside the home. It was her way of leaving a trace, a single thread of intention in a web of uncertainty. By 11 p.m., the house had fallen into an unnatural quiet. Even the clock seemed to slow. The mother took one last look at her daughter's door, the faint outline of her sleeping figure casting a long shadow across the hallway. For a fleeting moment, a pang of doubt cut through her resolve. Would the daughter ever forgive her? Would she understand? She turned away, past the familiar furniture, past the photographs of family vacations now tinged with unspoken tension. She opened the door to the outside world. The cool air brushed her face, carrying the faint scent of the street, the distant bark of a dog, and the whisper of leaves stirred by the wind. Step by step, she moved away from the house, each footfall measured, deliberate. The world seemed deceptively ordinary. Streetlights cast their long, indifferent beams. Cars passed without noticing her. Neighbors slept unaware. The quiet of the night was almost comforting, yet it held a tension that tightened in her chest with every step. She reached the corner and paused, glancing back at the house. It looked unchanged, ordinary, safe, but she knew it was neither. It was a house of secrets, of fractured trust, of decisions that had already begun to fracture her own life. Minutes later, she vanished, not with a struggle, not with chaos, not even with a single sound. She simply stepped beyond the familiar, into uncertainty, leaving behind everything she had ever relied upon. By morning, the absence would be noticed. The voicemail, the brief note, the locked house, all that would raise questions. But that night, only shadows bore witness. Only the faint whisper of the wind and the subtle rustling of leaves marked her passing. The mother had taken control in the only way left to her. She had stepped beyond the reach of observation, into the space where consequences met preparation, where truth collided with power. And in doing so, she became a mystery, one that would ripple outward and touch every life she had left behind. The next day, investigators would begin to trace her steps. But even they would struggle to reconstruct a choice made with absolute clarity and absolute fear. For in that silence, the world would learn what the mother already knew. Some truths are too heavy to carry openly, some courage too isolating, and some disappearances too quiet to ever be fully explained. And somewhere in the spaces between revelation and consequence, her daughter and the teacher would awaken to a reality neither had anticipated. The mother's absence was now more powerful than any presence had ever been. The ripple of her decision was only beginning, and no one could predict where it would reach next. By the next morning, the mother's absence had transformed the quiet house into a focal point of unease. The kitchen table, once ordinary, became a stage for speculation. The note she had left behind, a few simple sentences, factual controlled, was carefully examined, photocopied, filed. And yet, it provided no answers, only questions. Questions that would multiply, unfold, and twist into narratives that threatened to escape anyone's control. Investigators arrived in pairs, notebooks in hand, voices calm but eyes sharp. They moved through the house as if it were a crime scene, cataloging the ordinary. The coffee mug, still half full, the folded laundry, the precise placement of chairs. Every detail mattered. Every inconsistency was a potential clue, and every silence, especially the silence of the daughter, loomed larger than any physical evidence. The daughter's first statements were cautious, practiced, and disturbingly composed. "I last saw her last night," she said, voice steady. She said she was going for a walk. She avoided the phrasing of exposure, avoided the word affair, avoided anything that might cast blame. Her mother's decision, her disappearance, seemed not to have shaken her. On the surface, she was calm, too calm. The teacher was next. He arrived with a calm demeanor that could be mistaken for confidence or manipulation. He described the mother as a concerned parent, careful and precise, and spoke of the daughter in terms that blurred the line between admiration and intimacy. Every phrase was measured, each word carefully chosen to appear reasonable. Investigators would later note that his composure was disturbingly rehearsed. It was when the accounts began to intersect that tension grew. The daughter and the teacher's stories, while not identical, seemed to converge in ways that suggested alignment. Small details, meeting times, location, conversations, matched up too neatly. Yet subtle discrepancies emerged, so minor at first that they could be dismissed, but they grew in the telling. A time misremembered here. A word phrased differently there. Each contradiction small, but collectively, they created a fissure in the narrative. Investigators sensed it immediately. The truth was splintering, not in one dramatic revelation, but in subtle, almost imperceptible shifts. Each story supported its own version of reality, and in the space between them, the mother's disappearance became a mirror reflecting what could not be spoken aloud. Neighbors added fragments. A late-night light in the living room, a shadow moving near the window, a quiet car that lingered a block away. None of it confirmed guilt or malice, but each piece, when layered over the daughter's silence and the teacher's careful composure, painted a picture of tension, influence, and moral ambiguity. The media quickly latched onto the story. Headlines danced on the edges of accusation, careful to avoid explicit claims, yet impossible to ignore. Mother vanishes after alleged school scandal, read one. Teacher and daughter speak. Mystery deepens, read another. The word spread beyond the household, transforming private uncertainty into public speculation. For the daughter, the increasing attention added pressure. She became a character in a narrative she could not control, her silence both shield and weapon. Every question she avoided, every phrase she measured, added weight to the story. And the teacher, calm, composed, untouchable, remained the axis around which the shifting reality spun. Investigators found themselves caught in the space between two truths, the one they could verify and the one that was being hidden behind carefully aligned stories. Every statement, every alibi, every account required scrutiny. Yet even meticulous analysis could not fully bridge the gap between what had happened and what was being presented. By the end of the week, the realization was unavoidable. The mother's disappearance had exposed more than a secret affair. It had revealed fractured loyalties, hidden influences, and the ways in which narratives can be constructed to protect or manipulate. People began to question not only the daughter and the teacher, but also the mother herself. What had she known? What had she expected? And how much did her own decisions contribute to the chaos? In the quiet moments, when investigators pored over statements and timelines, one truth became painfully clear. Stories, even those told with perfect composure, rarely align perfectly when human emotion and moral complexity are involved. And sometimes, the gaps between stories reveal more than the stories themselves. The tension between narrative and reality would not ease. Every interview, every recollection, every small discrepancy widened the chasm, leaving the mother's disappearance at the center, an unmovable, enigmatic anchor around which all the conflicting accounts swirled. And as investigators began to map timelines, cross-check alibis, and confront inconsistencies, one fact stood out above all. The more they tried to force alignment, the more the truth seemed to slip. The next chapter would confront that slippage head-on, exposing not only the power dynamics that had shaped the daughter and the teacher, but also the emotional toll exacted on everyone involved. The mother's absence was no longer just a mystery. It was a mirror reflecting the fractures, loyalties, and manipulations that had existed long before the exposure, and that would continue to ripple long after. The days following a mother's disappearance became a study in invisible forces, a quiet battlefield of control, influence, and unspoken truths. For the daughter, each passing hour reinforced the power the teacher held, not just over her, but over the narrative itself. He moved through the scrutiny of investigators with calculated calm, speaking in measured tones, framing his words carefully so that questions could be answered without vulnerability, without misstep. His authority was a shield, his composure a weapon. The daughter, by contrast, was trapped in silence, not out of fear exactly, but out of necessity. She understood, even in her defiance, that words carried consequences she could not yet measure. Every response risked exposing what she had built in secret, the bond that had become both her sanctuary and her prison. She had learned, consciously or not, that loyalty, even misplaced, was a currency she could not squander. Investigators, methodical and persistent, tried to peel back the layers, but each interaction revealed more complexity than clarity. The teacher's alignment with the daughter's account created a veneer consistency, yet subtle cracks were evident. A hesitation here. A carefully timed pause there. Micro-expressions, almost imperceptible, hinted at unspoken guilt, or at least a careful management of it. The mother's absence had shifted the balance of power, and those left behind were forced to navigate it with a heightened sense of caution. Meanwhile, the daughter wrestled privately with guilt she could not articulate. She had watched her mother act decisively, even courageously, and yet she felt anger in its place. Anger that blurred with fear, loyalty, and self-preservation. She questioned herself constantly. Did she deserve intervention? Did she deserve protection? Was she the victim, the perpetrator, or some tangled combination of both? Every reflection led to more questions, each echoing louder in the hollow space her mother had left behind. Friends and extended family began to weigh in, cautiously at first, then more insistently. Their inquiries were polite, bordering on intrusive, their concern thinly veiled judgment. Every conversation tested the daughter's ability to maintain her composure, to protect her version of events, to preserve the carefully constructed alignment with the teacher. She realized, perhaps too late, that silence could not shield her forever. It was both armor and cage. The teacher, too, was not untouched by the weight of consequence. Though he appeared untouchable in public, the private moments, small slips, a tightened jaw, a lingering glance, revealed that he too understood the fragility of control. He had cultivated influence, yes, but influence is always conditional. Every investigation, every question, every whisper in the hallways of the school reminded him that power is never absolute, and guilt, whether conscious or unconscious, had a way of threading itself into even the most carefully constructed personas. The mother's absence lingered like a shadow, a constant presence shaping every interaction. Investigators speculated, colleagues whispered, and the daughter navigated her own tangled loyalties with precision that was almost clinical. Yet beneath the surface, emotions surged, confusion, regret, defensiveness, fear, all trapped beneath layers of composure. In quiet, private moments, the daughter considered the consequences she could not voice, the teacher's influence, the mother's courage, the boundaries that had been crossed. Each thought felt dangerous, even forbidden. She understood that some truths, no matter how clear, could not be spoken without fracturing the fragile world she had helped maintain. The lesson was subtle but unavoidable. Power and influence shape what is seen and unseen. Guilt and morality shape what is said and unsaid. And in the space between these forces, human behavior bends in ways that often escape reason. By the time investigators began connecting timelines, comparing statements, and examining the gaps between stories, the emotional weight became almost tangible. Every action carried consequence. Every silence hinted at complicity, and every confession that remained unspoken grew louder than words. The mother's disappearance had not only exposed a relationship, it had exposed the fragility of truth when confronted with influence and fear. It had revealed the human tendency to shield, to align, and to manipulate in ways that are psychologically intricate and morally ambiguous. And as days turned to weeks, one undeniable reality emerged. Some truths could never be fully articulated. Some guilt could never be confessed. And some power, once established, could not be undone. The daughter and the teacher had navigated the aftermath to the limits of their control, but the ripple effects, unseen and unstoppable, were only just beginning to touch the wider world. The next chapter would confront the final consequences of these hidden dynamics, exploring how time, absence, and unresolved guilt reshape lives, leaving echoes long after the original act has faded. The mother's disappearance was no longer just a mystery. It had become a prism, refracting power, guilt, and silence in ways that demanded recognition, even if acknowledgement came too late. Months passed, and the world outside the mother's home moved on as if nothing had changed. Life went forward for neighbors, colleagues, and even the investigators assigned to her disappearance. But inside, the story refused to settle. Every unanswered question, every silence, every misaligned narrative lingered like a shadow over everyone involved. The daughter returned to her routine, school, and social life, but she did so under the constant weight of her mother's absence. Her conversations were careful, measured. Her laughter, when it appeared, was lighter than before, almost rehearsed. The teacher maintained his composure publicly, But the subtle tension that investigators had noted continued to shadow his every move. Power, once clear and absolute, had become a negotiation with invisible consequences. The investigation itself became a maze of conflicting accounts. Every witness recalled different details. Every timeline had its inconsistencies, and no physical evidence could confirm what had happened that night. The note left behind, the voicemail recorded before her disappearance. These were all fragments, incomplete and open to interpretation. Every lead that promised clarity dissolved into ambiguity. Law enforcement classified the case as an ongoing missing person investigation, but unofficially, it became a study in uncertainty. Analysts examined patterns of behavior, communications, and emotional dynamics, trying to reconstruct the mother's final hours. Psychologists were consulted to interpret the daughter's composure, the teacher's responses, and the ripple effect on the family. Yet for all the scrutiny, one truth remained. The mother's disappearance could not be fully explained. Rumors spread quietly, initially whispered among neighbors, then across online forums, until speculation itself became a secondary story. Some suggested she had planned the disappearance carefully, that she had anticipated consequences far beyond what anyone could imagine. Others imagined foul play, blaming unseen actors, unknown forces, or coincidences. But speculation could never replace clarity. Facts remained elusive, buried beneath layers of fear, loyalty, and secrecy. Even those closest to the daughter wrestled with guilt and uncertainty. Was she complicit, intentionally or not? Had she truly understood the stakes? Or had she allowed herself to be swept into circumstances she could not control? The lines between victim and participant blurred in ways that would haunt everyone for years. The mother's absence, however, continued to serve as a silent, omnipresent force. It shaped decisions, conversations, and relationships long after she had vanished. The lesson she left behind, about courage, responsibility, and the cost of truth, was as heavy as it was unresolved. Those who tried to honor her intentions discovered that morality, when weighed against human complexity, was never simple. Despite extensive investigation, the case remained officially unresolved. No one could definitively say what had happened or why. The daughter grew up in the shadow of questions she would carry forever. The teacher maintained his life, never fully free from suspicion, never fully untethered from the mother's absence. The community remembered her as a woman who took a stand, who exposed a truth too dangerous to ignore, and then disappeared without a trace. In time, the disappearance became legend, a cautionary tale whispered in schools, among parents, and in private conversations. But legend, like memory, is selective. It emphasizes some truths and obscures others. And so, the mother's story continued to resonate in fragments, a voice on a voicemail, a note left behind, a daughter's silence, and a teacher's unbroken calm. The case never closed. Yet closure was never the point. The mother's courage, her decision to act despite the cost, and her disappearance became a permanent mirror. It reflected not only the dangers of manipulation, secrecy, and hidden loyalties, but also the moral complexity of those left to reckon with what could not be undone. And so, the story ended, without resolution, without certainty, but with the haunting clarity of consequences that rippled far beyond a single act, leaving traces in the lives of everyone who remained. Time passed, but the absence never softened. The mother's disappearance had carved a hollow in the lives of everyone involved, a quiet emptiness that refused to be filled. It was more than a physical void. It was a moral one, a space where the consequences of truth, loyalty, and courage linger like shadows at dusk. For the daughter, life became a careful balance between memory and denial. She lived with the knowledge of what had happened, yet she also learned how to live without speaking it aloud. Every decision she made, every relationship she formed, carried the weight of unspoken truths. She understood, in ways she could not name, that the mother's actions had shaped her, even in absence. Courage and consequence, responsibility and fear, these were the invisible inheritance she carried. The teacher, too, faced his own reckoning. His public composure remained intact, but private moments revealed tension that no one else could see. Power is seductive, but it is also fragile. Influence, when unbalanced by accountability, can unravel in ways even the most controlled minds cannot anticipate. In the shadows of her absence, he confronted the limits of authority, the fragility of perception, and the moral cost of manipulation. Friends, neighbors, and extended family continued to speculate, to question, to construct stories that only partially aligned with reality. They spoke of what had been lost, of what might have been prevented, of the impossibility of truly understanding another's choices. And in those conversations, the mother's presence remained unseen, unheard, but profoundly felt. The mother's disappearance, though unresolved, had left a quiet but undeniable lesson. Truth, no matter how carefully delivered, carries weight. It carries consequences not only for the one who acts, but for everyone tethered to that act. Acting courageously does not guarantee justice, understanding, or gratitude. Sometimes it guarantees isolation, misinterpretation, and fear. Yet the choice to act, even in the face of potential harm, remains a measure of character that cannot be erased. In quiet moments, the daughter would sometimes replay the voicemail, hear the final note left behind, and imagine her mother's resolve. The clarity, the determination, the moral courage, all of it existed beyond judgment or consequence. It was a truth she could never undo, but she could also never fully claim. The teacher, if he reflected at all, might have felt a similar acknowledgement, not of guilt exactly, but of recognition. The mother had stepped beyond fear, beyond control, beyond the influence of circumstance. And in doing so, she had left behind a mark that no manipulation could erase. The community remembered her differently. Some as a vanished figure of mystery, others as a woman who acted with unwavering resolve in a world full of compromises. Everyone who encountered her story, in whispers, in headlines, or in private reflection, understood something fundamental. Courage is not measured by comfort or approval, but by the willingness to face consequences for what is right. In the end, the mother did not return. She remained a silent force, a ghost in the lives she had touched. But her actions resonated. They reshaped relationships, exposed hidden loyalties, and revealed the unseen cost of choices made in pursuit of truth. And perhaps that was a final lesson. Some truths cannot be contained, some courage cannot be ignored, and some disappearances, though tragic, leave a clarity that permanence cannot erase. The story ended without answers, but with the unshakable reality of consequence, and the haunting understanding that truth, when chosen over convenience, always comes at a cost.